Taliban veterans like to laugh about the first time, according to their lore, that the Russians dumped a lot of American dollars on them. During the Taliban campaign to take over all of Afghanistan in 1995, they actually had a few fighter planes, and they used one to force a Russian cargo plane, a huge Ilyushin Il-76TD flying for a company called Airstan, to land in Kandahar.
The Taliban held the Russian crew members prisoner for a year until, one day, they supposedly escaped and managed to take the plane with them. How many millions of dollars that took to arrange, the Taliban have never said, but after the long, bloody decade of the 1980s throwing off Soviet occupation, squeezing the Russians for money like that remains a source of amusement.
Mullah Manan Niazi, who was the spokesman for Taliban leader Mullah Omar in those days, brought up the incident when the Daily Beast asked him about reports that the Russians have offered, and perhaps paid, bounties to Taliban who kill American soldiers.
The Russians paying US dollars, it's not odd for the Taliban, he said, his voice fraught with irony over the encrypted phone call as he recalled the Airstan incident. As for the current situation, the Taliban have been paid by Russian intelligence for attacks on U.S. forces, and on ISIS forces, in Afghanistan from 2014 up to the present.
In the world of intelligence gathering, such a statement from such a figure would be worth noting, and just the kind of thing that could lead to what the Trump White House has called inconclusive reporting the Russian offer of bounties to kill Americans.
Mullah Manan Niazi was a very senior figure in the Taliban when they were in power, and also when they were driven into exile and underground after 2001. But since the death of Mullah Omar was made public in 2015, he has been a dissident and liable to be killed by the current Taliban leadership if it catches up with him. They have accused him of collaborating with the CIA and the Afghan government's intelligence service, the National Directorate of Security (NDS), which he denies.
So, Niazi speaks as someone who knows the organization and its top people very well, but who also has an agenda very different from theirs, with his own reasons for confirming the bounty story, and he does not offer further specifics on that. But he does offer details about what he says are the long-standing ties between the Taliban and the Russians as well as the Iranians, and U.S. officials have been tracking those developments.
A U.S. intelligence report about Russian assistance to the Taliban has circulated on Capitol Hill and throughout the national security apparatus over the last several days. According to 3 individuals who have read or who are familiar with the report, the assessment is long and covers the span of several years, focusing generally on how Russia provides support, including financial assistance, to the Taliban. The report also touches on the Russian bounties first reported by the New York Times, though those who read the report say that data point is circumstantial and that the investigation is ongoing. 2 individuals who spoke to the Daily Beast, though, said it is clear from the report that there's an increased risk for U.S. troops in Afghanistan because of Russia's behavior.
In important ways, this classified report mirrors an unclassified document produced last month by the Congressional Research Service which offered a crisp summation. In the past 2 years, multiple U.S. commanders have warned of increased levels of assistance, and perhaps even material support for the Taliban from Russia and Iran, both of which cite Islamic State (ISIS) presence in Afghanistan to justify their activities. Both nations were opposed to the Taliban government of the late 1990s, but reportedly see the Taliban as a useful point of leverage vis-a-vis the United States.
We introduced 2 Taliban to the Russians undercover as businessmen, said Niazi looking back on operations when he was still part of the Taliban insurgent leadership. They went to Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. With Russian-supplied funds, we purchased oil, wheat and flour and imported it to Afghanistan and then sold it there. That's how we converted Russians' funds to cash in Afghanistan.
Both men, contacted by the Daily Beast, vehemently denied such activity. I don't want to comment, I don't even want to talk about Niazi, said one of them who, as a matter of fact, pays frequent visits to Moscow. Niazi is our enemy and playing into the hands of the NDS.
Other monies come through the Hawala system, which originated in India and is used throughout South Asia and, now, in many other parts of the world. The U.S. Treasury notes Hawala is distinguished by trust and the extensive use of connections such as family relationships or regional affiliations. Unlike traditional banking, Hawala makes minimal, often no, use of any sort of negotiable instrument. Transfers of money take place based on communications between members of a network of hawaladars, or hawala dealers.
A senior Afghan security officer told the Daily Beast that he is not aware of any Russians smuggling money, but noted that the International Financial Action Task Force combating support for terrorism recently put pressure on the Afghan government to take practical action against suspect hawala dealers, so the Afghan security forces raided some of the money changers.
Many sources, including Mullah Manan Niazi, note the Russian and Iranian role supporting the Taliban in the fight against the so-called Islamic State in Khorasan, aka ISIS-K or ISIL-K.
Early on in the Trump administration, General John Nicholson, then the commander of NATO's Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan, warned Congress that Russia has become more assertive over the past year in Afghanistan and was overtly lending legitimacy to the Taliban to undermine NATO efforts and bolster belligerence using the false narrative that only the Taliban are fighting ISIL-K.
Russia reportedly complemented its public rhetorical support for the Taliban with a covert supply program. The Washington Post reported that year that U.S. intelligence believed Russia had sent machine guns to the Taliban. An anonymous military source told the Post that the U.S. had found Russian-provided weapons areas where the group was waging war on coalition forces and ISIS's Afghan affiliate had little presence.
"We'd had weapons brought to this headquarters and given to us by Afghan leaders, who said, this was given by the Russians to the Taliban," Nicholson said in a 2018 BBC interview. "We know that the Russians are involved."
Indeed, various Taliban have told the Daily Beast they were quite proud of the guns they were given as gifts or rewards, whether for specific acts or simply to cement relationships, is unclear.
In 2018, Russia denied reports that it sent any arms, but Russian Special Envoy Zamir Kabulov admitted that Moscow had established contacts with the Taliban because it was seriously worried about possible terror threats for the Russian mission and Russian citizens in Afghanistan.
But in September 2019, Russia elevated its talks with the insurgents to a formal visit by a Taliban delegation in September.
According to a well-placed Taliban source, after some of the group's representatives made a trip to Moscow, they were given 30 state-of-the-art guns, apparently large-caliber sniper rifles powerful enough to shoot through walls. "I personally saw 3 of them in Helmand," said the source. "They were still full of grease, which is to say brand new out of the box."
As military scholar David Kilcullen points out in his recent book The Dragons and the Snakes, How the Rest Learned to Fight the West, the U.S. obsession with its global war on terror after 9/11 created an opportunity for Russia and other hostile powers. They were exploiting our exclusive focus on terrorism, seeking to fill the geopolitical, economic, and security vacuum we had left as we became bogged down in the wars of occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan.
In the present day, it serves Russia's interests to keep the United States bogged down there, despite official Russian statements to the contrary.
What others call hybrid warfare, Kilcullen defines somewhat differently as exploitation of situations in flux, which certainly is the case in Afghanistan with a U.S. president determined to declare he's made a complete exit, even though there are only 8,600 U.S. troops left on the ground at the moment.
Things that are in limbo, transitioning, or on the periphery, that have ambiguous political, legal, and psychological status, or whose very existence is debated, or liminal, write Kilcullen. Liminal warfare exploits this character of ambiguity, operating in the blur, or as some Western military organizations put it, the gray zone.
That, precisely, is where the Russians have learned to thrive.
With additional reporting by Sam Brody.
In early March, while President Donald Trump's loudest allies at Fox News downplayed the coronavirus pandemic, with some claiming it was nothing more than an impeachment scam to destroy the president, Tucker Carlson received widespread, and unusual, considering his notoriously far-right rhetoric, praise for calling out his colleagues and Trump for minimizing the impending danger.
The Fox News primetime star continues to receive plaudits for reportedly convincing the president to take the crisis seriously. Days after that March 9 monologue, which was delivered shortly after Carlson privately spoke with Trump about the virus, the president publicly addressed the nation and his administration began pushing social distancing guidelines.
While Carlson sounding the alarm so early on may have had a positive impact on his viewers, especially, as studies show his audience took protective measures before Trump confidant Sean Hannity's, it didn't take long for the right-wing TV host to shift gears and rage against social distancing, lockdowns, and any other measure implemented to slow the spread of the virus.
Over the past 2 months, Carlson has devoted much of his coronavirus coverage to discrediting public health experts, specifically top infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci, a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. On top of telling his audience to stop listening to Fauci and other health officials, the Fox News star has repeatedly boosted a fellow contrarian, former New York Times reporter turned spy novelist Alex Berenson, as an expert on COVID-19.
Less than a month after his much-lauded call to action on the virus, Carlson declared the crisis to be over, a claim that received far less attention from the mainstream press than his rogue stance against the president. Despite the United States having already experienced 13,000 deaths by that point, Carlson pointed to revised models that showed fewer estimated deaths, claiming stay-at-home orders should be eased because the short-term crisis may have passed.
Since the Fox star's assertion that the pandemic was over and it was time to go back to business as usual, the nation has suffered roughly 115,000 more deaths and at least 2 million more confirmed cases.
Carlson, in his quest to convince viewers that social distancing was futile and lockdowns were useless, began taking aim at Fauci almost immediately, framing the Medal of Freedom honoree as a power-hungry bureaucrat. Furthermore, the conservative talk show host repeatedly portrayed the top doctor as incompetent and unknowledgeable about infectious diseases.
One way Carlson often sharply criticized the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases was by highlighting his shifting opinions on the virus as more information became known about the disease. In particular, he hit Fauci for initially saying mask wearing was unnecessary, a position the renowned immunologist quickly reversed, as have other health officials who initially worried that masks might instill a false sense of security.
At one point in mid-May, after Senator Rand Paul dressed down Fauci in a Senate hearing, Carlson applauded the pro-Trump Republican before delivering his own lengthy takedown of Fauci, arguing that the top doctor's advice was buffoon-level stuff, and later describing him as the chief buffoon of the professional class. Weeks earlier, Carlson called it national suicide for Fauci to urge aggressive social distancing restrictions.
"We should never let someone like that run this country," he fumed.
In addition to repeatedly dismissing social distancing, Carlson has also told his viewers that the virus is just not that deadly, even as the death toll continues to rise. In late April, for instance, Carlson pointed to some antibody studies, which have since largely been dismissed due to a large number of false positive statistical errors, and the laughable claims made by a pair of California doctors who pushed for reopening by claiming the disease just isn't nearly as deadly as we thought it was.
The segment was steeped in so much disinformation on the disease that MSNBC host Chris Hayes, Carlson's direct 8 p.m. time slot competitor, directly called him out for peddling coronavirus trutherism.
There is a reason many of the employees of Fox News, which is based in New York, are working from home right now, Hayes pointedly stated. At least someone there understands why it is important to continue to keep physical distance.
Weeks later, Carlson again pointed to antibody tests and cherry-picked surveys to claim the deadly virus was relatively tame.
We now know, thanks to widespread blood testing, that the virus isn't that deadly, he said on May 21. An enormous percentage of coronavirus infections produce mild symptoms or no symptoms at all, they're asymptomatic. The death toll is a tiny fraction of what we were told it would be.
Carlson, meanwhile, has also seemed more than willing to spread the idea that the death toll, which is now approaching 130,000, is overinflated and possibly a hoax, despite overwhelming evidence showing it has likely been undercounted. Besides giving airtime to COVID contrarian, Berenson, who has repeatedly suggested the death toll is inflated or would remain low, he has also hosted Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume to make those same claims.
Dr. Birx said tonight during the briefing at the White House that all deaths from anyone who died with coronavirus is counted as if the person died from coronavirus. Now, we all know that isn't true, Hume said on April 7 before relaying anecdotal evidence. I remember my own doctor telling me at one point when I was discussing prostate issues, he said about prostate cancer, I didn't have it, as it happened, but he said, you know, a lot more people die with it than die from it.
Amid nationwide unrest in recent weeks following the Minneapolis police killing of George Floyd, an unarmed black man, Carlson has spent far more time demonizing the Black Lives Matter movement than covering the outbreak of new coronavirus cases, many of which are occurring in the states that rushed to reopen.
When the Fox host did shift from fear-mongering about a race war to cover the virus, however, he actively minimized the damage of the pandemic while once again claiming lockdowns do not work.
Just as multiple states began seeing a massive uptick in confirmed cases after restrictions were eased and celebrations were held for Memorial Day weekend, Carlson definitively declared social distancing rules to be useless.
We do think it's worth, for a minute, taking a pause to assess whether or not they were in fact lying to us about the coronavirus and our response to it, he said on June 10, complaining of a double standard in how lockdown protests and police brutality demonstrations were portrayed in the media. And the short answer to this is, yes, they were definitely lying.
As a matter of public health, we can say conclusively the lockdowns were not necessary. In fact, we can prove that, and here's the most powerful evidence. States that never locked down at all, states where people were allowed to live like Americans and not cower indoors alone, in the end turned out no worse than states that had mandatory quarantines. The state you probably live in, Carlson continued. The states that did lock down at first but were quick to reopen have not seen explosions of coronavirus cases.
Since making that proclamation, Florida, Texas, and Arizona have all set single-day records for confirmed cases, and have reported newly overwhelmed hospitals and ICU capacity.
Presented with Carlson's repeated claims that social distancing and stay-at-home orders were unnecessary, Dr. Erwin Redlener, a Daily Beast contributor and director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University, outright dismissed the TV host's analysis.
Tucker Carlson is one of the most fervent anti-science commentators on the airway, the public health activist told the Daily Beast. He, like Sean Hannity, seems to relish in unwavering support for Donald Trump, no matter how outlandish, dishonest or ignorant the president's statements or policies might be. I assume that Tucker is probably a bright guy, but his uncritical support of Trump is a dangerous disservice to his audience.
While Carlson has privately advised the president on several issues and is regularly cited on the president's Twitter account, he has also stood out among his Fox primetime peers in offering up criticism of Trump. Besides subtly calling the president out over his COVID-19 response, Carlson has also knocked the president for not being tough enough in dealing with the protests, arguing that his weak response is placing him on a trajectory to lose.
An analysis from Columbia University, meanwhile, has found that if the United States had implemented physical distancing guidelines just 1 week earlier in March, as many as 36,000 American lives could have been saved.
As Carlson has dismissed the expertise of epidemiologists and scientists, while boosting spy novelists and talking heads, he has occasionally sought the advice of actual medical professionals to provide pandemic analysis. One of the most frequent voices on his show in this respect has been Fox News medical contributor Dr. Mark Siegel. The Fox News primetime star has blasted Fauci and others for their inaccurate predictions and so-called buffoonery, but he apparently doesn't have an issue with Siegel's history of comically over-the-top projections and medical punditry that seems to bend over backwards to please the Fox audience. For example, Siegel, who infamously said in March that the worst case for coronavirus is that it will be the flu, told Carlson last month that we're not going to have a big second wave, citing the low number of cases in Australia. That's the Southern Hemisphere, he said. That's essentially our November right now. He would eventually walk back that claim on Carlson's show days later, noting that Brazil, which is also in the Southern Hemisphere, was experiencing a huge surge in cases. And last week, Siegel lashed out at the European Union for moving to ban American visitors due to the latest rise in cases. Could this be retaliatory? Possibly, he huffed. Could it be public health? Whatever it is not the tone they sounded back in March, when they were horrified at our travel ban, at a time when thousands and thousands of cases were coming here.
And then the unmistakably Carlson-esque reactionary barb. So I have a message for the European Union tonight. How about remembering what we did for you in the middle of the 20th century?